All right, so I want to talk a little bit about the inclusive hiring manager. So there will be a couple of parts to this course. The first part, we'll talk about inclusive leadership and what inclusive leadership looks like. Then we'll move into, we'll talk a little bit about unconscious bias. We'll talk some about culture. And then we'll talk about like, how do you structure an inclusive interview? And then what are some tips that you should be using as a part of your inclusive interview process, right? So everybody on your team, how should you be thinking? How should you be behaving? And what kinds of questions should you be asking as a part of this inclusive hiring manager's process? So we'll go ahead and get into that. So the inclusive hiring manager is actually a set of skills that are not very common among folks, right? So the key really is to be thoughtful about every aspect of your process, particularly as it applies to diversity and inclusion goals. And so if you have some goals in mind, that will help lead you through this inclusive hiring manager process. And we'll talk more about that. So what is inclusive leadership? We'd like to submit to you that there are 5 aspects of inclusive leadership that we like to kind of address really quickly in this section. And so there's inclusive mindset, there is cultural competence and agility, greater adaptability, cognizant of unconscious bias, and fosters or creates a sense of belonging, right? So fosters a sense of belonging. When we talk about an inclusive mindset, it really is a mindset, a thinking process that is encouraging of looking at diversity as an asset and not as a compliance issue or something that should be tolerated, right? So the inclusive mindset really looks at the strategic advantages and the strengths that diversity can offer and does its best to maximize that. When we talk about cultural competence and agility, what we're really talking about is recognizing the context, recognizing what tools are available to you. And the agility part is to apply the appropriate knowledge, skills, and ability to the context in a culturally responsive way, in a culturally appropriate way. And so how do we know if something is appropriate or whatnot? It really is about how do you want to be effective. So if you can interact with a culture, engage in cross-cultural communication in such a way, or even conflict in such a way that it yields beneficial, effective fruit based on your goals, then you've had a positive outcome as it pertains to being agile in cross-cultural spaces, right? So that's important. We also recognize that there are tons of disruptors that require leaders to be adaptable to those contexts. Well, we've always done it that way. Exactly. Great, right? But the context now is very different than it was when you first started doing it that way, right? So recognizing that. And so what are the skills that leaders need to be able to adapt to the new context? And then recognizing unconscious bias, right? So we all come from a context, which means that we all come from a particular or have a particular worldview. And that worldview is full of bias. And so we'll talk about how do you short circuit, work around, or override your bias so that you still achieve your goals. And then lastly, this fostering a sense of belonging. We want employees to feel that they can bring their full and best selves to work, because we know that when we do that, we get the best of them, and their discretionary effort is greatly increased, right? So we want to foster environments where people can bring their full and best selves to work, to our organizations, so that we can maximize all of their strengths as it pertains to reaching the organization's goals. So when we talk about inclusive leadership, those are the 5 things that we talk about: inclusive mindset, cultural competence and agility, greater adaptability, cognizant of unconscious bias, and creating or fostering a sense of belonging.